Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. How many times have we heard about that staggering statistic that nearly 40% or so of Americans can't pay for a $400 emergency? This number comes from the Federal Reserve's annual survey of economic well-being of U.S. households. Now, hearing a number like that immediately grabs your attention because $400 is a very reasonable expense that could pop up in anyone's life, but I feel like it's worth taking a deeper dive into these headlines. The $400 emergency question has been a staple of the Fed's annual survey since 2013. And there's been a fairly substantial increase in the number of respondents who can say, yes, they could cover a $400 emergency over the past decade. Back in 2013, that number was around 50%. It peaked at nearly 70% following COVID stimulus funding, which helped survey respondents keep a little extra cash on hand, and recently it's hovered around 63%. At first glance, this might create the interpretation that Americans are getting better with their finances, but I do think it's worth interpreting this graph with a little bit of caution, because the Fed has asked the same exact question regarding this $400 unexpected emergency since 2013, and a $400 unexpected emergency in 2023 is not exactly the same as a $400 emergency in 2024. We have to factor in inflation, and that means that a $400 emergency from 2013 might look more like a $550 emergency today. This may seem subtle, but I do think it's an important point to consider. I do think the Fed would be better served if they index their number to inflation, because I think it would be a better representation of what they're truly trying to uncover, and that is who would be able to reasonably cover an unexpected emergency. The Fed survey does acknowledge that there is likely some error due to interpretation. Some of those who would not have paid an unexpected $400 expense with cash or its equivalents likely still had access to $400 in cash. Instead of using that cash to pay for the expense, they may have chosen to preserve their cash as a buffer for other expenses. The way these news articles portray this headline, it makes you feel like so many people are one $400 emergency away from total financial ruin. But the Federal Reserve itself portrays something different. They acknowledge that there's choice involved. They acknowledge that there's a significant number of people who would choose not to pull this $400 from their accounts even if this cash was available. To explore this potential difference between how people would pay for a small unexpected expense or whether they could pay for it with cash or the equivalent, the survey included a question asking people what the largest emergency expense was that they could handle using only savings. And when phrased this way, it shows that nearly 70% of people could cover an emergency of $500 or more. A significant improvement even at a higher dollar amount. Now, as to why people may not be willing to use these funds even if they're available, well, that's an entirely different question. Perhaps it revolves around how the question is interpreted and what type of emergency comes to mind when people think about using these funds. But this graph does seem to illustrate two extremes. Those who have a fairly well-funded emergency fund. In fact, the Federal Reserve study indicated that 54% of respondents had set aside 3 months' worth of expenses, or what they called a rainy day fund. And then we have those on the other end of the spectrum who would struggle to cover a $100 emergency. Based on the Fed's own data, it's interesting to see that some 37% of respondents actually do have the cash, but would take out debt in an emergency in order to preserve a cash buffer for other emergencies. What the news articles with the headline screaming that 40% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency leads the typical reader to believe is that many Americans are teetering on a very risky financial situation. But when you dig into the data a little bit, you see that it's 13% who say that when push comes to shove, they absolutely would not be able to cover this $400 emergency, a stat that has remained fairly consistent over the course of the survey. So what exactly do the other respondents say they would do if they didn't have or didn't want to use the cash on hand to cover this unexpected expense? The most popular options are to put the expense on a credit card, borrow money from a friend or a family member. Then less popular options would be to sell something, get a loan from a bank, or to use a payday loan. Now, going into debt or turning to a loved one to cover an unexpected expense is certainly not ideal, and each of these scenarios would have a different cost associated with them. As a general rule of thumb, the less barriers there are to borrowing money, the steeper the interest rate you would likely have to pay to get it. Let's explore the potential cost of the most popular option if liquid savings was not used to cover this unexpected emergency, and that is a credit card. Roughly 80% of Americans have a credit card, so this is a very realistic option. The average interest rate on a typical credit card is about 25%. So that means if you're carrying a balance on your credit card, that debt is going to get very expensive very quickly. And remember, interest on credit cards is not simply applied to just the credit card balance. It also applies to any previously unpaid interest charges on credit cards. And this is inherently why credit cards become so dangerous. It's basically compound interest working against you. First and foremost, if you put an unexpected emergency on your credit card, but then turned around and paid off this credit card in full before the end of the month or by the time your statement balance came due, you would pay $0 in interest. At this point, this is simply a convenient way to cover this emergency. No additional cost was incurred. However, let's look at the other extreme. Let's say you put a $400 charge on a credit card, and that this is the only item you put on this credit card. If you only pay the minimum balance of $35, it would take you about 14 months to pay this off, and you would pay over $60 in interest. That's a long time to carry what is seemingly a smaller amount of debt and a fairly significant interest charge on the debt itself. But the thing to keep in mind with credit cards is that there's a lot of variability. Maybe one of the respondents to the Fed's survey wasn't able to pay off this credit card in full by the time that first month's balance came around. But what if they were able to clear up the balance in full over the course of, say, 2 months? In that case, they would have paid $12 in interest on this $400 unexpected expense. Or if instead it took 3 months to pay off this balance, this individual would pay about $16 in interest on top of the $400 expense. Certainly not an ideal situation, and I am certainly not advocating for carrying a credit card balance from month to month. Get those balances paid off in full and on time. And if you're someone who does find yourself carrying a credit card balance from month to month, just get it paid down and then ditch the credit card. You don't need a drag like that on your finances. But because so many people say that they would turn to credit cards for an emergency, I think it's worth considering how this type of debt would affect people. The next most popular option was to borrow the funds from a family member or a friend. Again, this is a very variable situation. For many, they may be able to turn to perhaps a parent who might loan them this money with no interest, or even on the basis of a gift without the anticipated expectation of repayment. It is worth keeping in mind that borrowing money from loved ones, whether it's friends or family, does have the ability to put some tension or strain on a relationship, so I would definitely be careful with this route. The next most popular option was to sell something. On the one hand, I like the idea of selling something in order to get the money to cover an expense, because that means you have the money. But on the other hand, if you're forced to sell something that you need in life, you kind of back yourself into a corner where you might have to replace this item down the road. And that can ultimately result in a higher cost burden if this is an item you need to replace. However, if this is an item you no longer need, it could absolutely be an effective solution. I do foresee that there could be a little bit of tension and a little bit of stress if you are forced to get rid of one item in order to pay for something else. One of the least popular options was to get a bank loan to cover this emergency. Getting a bank loan to cover an unexpected emergency is not really a convenient option, either from the time stance or from the financial perspective. From the time stance, there's an application process that involves a credit check, and that's going to affect your credit score. From a financial stance, there's going to be a lot of costs associated with obtaining a loan itself. Often, banks don't approve loans for such small amounts like $400. The loan may need to be at least $1,000, which would result in an additional debt that needs to be repaid. And it's worth keeping in mind that the interest rates on personal loans are generally set at a higher rate. As of June 2024, the average rate on a typical personal loan is about 12.5%, but they are heavily tied to your credit score. And the worse your credit score, the higher they go. They can go as high as 30%. So going to a bank to cover an unexpected emergency can make that emergency significantly more expensive. And while payday loans are listed as the least popular option, it's still worth touching on them. Payday loans are marketed as short-term loans, or simply in advance, with the goal of having them paid off by the time you get your next paycheck in about 2 weeks' time. Nearly anybody who applies is approved, so they're incredibly easy to get. The huge thing to keep in mind with payday loans is that they are incredibly predatory in nature. They have incredibly high interest rates. If you were to borrow $500 on a payday loan, in 2 weeks' time, when that loan comes due, you would owe about $575. Said another way, on an annual basis, they have an APR of nearly 400%. And while these are marketed as short-term loans, the companies that put them in place know exactly what they're doing. They know that most people who need them won't be able to pay them off when those 2 weeks roll around. And thus that starts an interest spiral. And oh yeah, by the time that 2 weeks passes, they'll bundle it up, repackage it as a new short-term loan, and there's a new rollover fee added on top. That's why so many states have actually outlawed payday loans, and honestly, it should be all states. Looking at the options that you can be forced into when you don't have emergency savings to draw on shows how expensive it really can be to not have money, which is kind of a conundrum in and of itself. Can 37% of Americans really not afford a $400 emergency? Well, that doesn't exactly seem to be the case. It does seem that people tend to be in better financial situations than what these headlines might lead us to believe. But that doesn't negate the fact that if you don't have emergency savings to fall back on, that emergency can get quite expensive quite quickly. What are your thoughts? Leave them in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. Pay it off in full by the end of the month, you would, I don't know. You can make the emergency. I was so close. Paycheck comes. Peanut butter cup. Can you stop? Please stop. Please stop.